man! Arise! Arise!
When you hear the name Dr. Mindbender, you probably think of a mustachioed, thick-accented individual from Team Cobra. I mean, it's really not the attire a scientist would wear, but the man was one of the greatest minds working for Cobra, someone who ended up creating Serpentor, so we'll let it slide just this once. However, his various adaptations throughout the franchise have taken many different approaches to working out his arc, and they've ended up making him a mad scientist in most of them, and although his origins have remained limited to just a few adaptations, some interpretations have offered hints about the character's evolution. So let's take a glance through the various lives of Dr. Mindbender and see how the man who created Serpentor turned out over time.
Use Sergeant Slaughter's DNA to replace Sun Tzu's in my creation.
Marvel's take. Humble beginnings of the crazy scientist. Dr. Mindbender made his debut in Marvel's G.I. Joe comic series with issue 44, which started out with a poorly conceived but somehow elaborate plan from Mindbender himself to thwart a couple of G.I. Joe newbies. It's honestly a hilarious arc where you see Dr. Mindbender, who's called Dr. Brainwave instead, use the popular battle android troopers to attack the Joes, but not with guns, using creeper plants that have puffballs which release sleeping gas. Why? Well, so that the damage is lessened, and instead of destroying the enemy vehicles, they can capture them. In Brainwave's own brainy words, a vehicle hit by a creeper bomb is reusable and resaleable. So the battle android troopers basically act like the delivery system. It's definitely pure silly G.I. Joe fun, and Dr. Brainwave goes through the entire arc of the issue trying to justify how his plan actually works. He makes Destro and Baroness go through a complete test of his experiment where he puts the newbie Joes through an army of the Bats. Even though it feels like the sea of bats might be a tough task for the Joes, they actually make it through. I mean, what did you expect? It's a classic take on G.I. Joe after all. Brainwave was just trying to do everything he could to get through to Cobra Commander, and even though his vast intellect came up short, the guy did end up working for Cobra. The best part was when, after failing with multiple attempts to put down the team of Joes, Brainwave was still hoping to defeat them and got into a van with Destro to see their experiment up close, only for the Joes to smash through the van. It's an interesting introduction story that actually made it clear how a character like Destro figures into the G.I. Joe lore. But the real origin story, something that would be brought in years later as a bonus issue, would appear in issue 32 and a half in 2008, titled A Day in the Life of Springfield. The story primarily follows a kid named Adam, but the real star of this story is his weird, kooky dentist, Dr. Binder. Why do we call him weird? Well, he's clearly the mad scientist we'd come to know later on, but here he's an innocent man. Innocent and mellow, as Adam describes him, and he's been working on a means to alleviate the pain that happens during dental procedures. That's something he really hates, the fact that his patients go through so much pain. And I mean, already we wish he was our dentist, but we aren't that lucky. Plus, the guy looked like he was a character right away with his bald appearance, the mustache, and the monocle, just a hat away from a muscular Mr. Monopoly guy in the early days. Anyways, Adam goes for his dental appointment, and Dr. Binder teases his invention so much that Adam asks to try it, but Binder is a good person. He won't treat his patients like test subjects. Instead, he tries it on himself first, something Adam convinces him to do quite easily. Dr. Binder tries the machine, and right then, we see multiple explosions as the man starts choking. As a result of this malfunction, we see Dr. Binder go through a complete personality change through a machine that was supposed to be for pain relief, and he ends up becoming Dr. Mindbender. Yeah, this was a pretty goofy attempt by Marvel. Seriously, Dr. Binder became Dr. Mindbender. I mean, all he had to do was put on a black cape and give a disgruntled look, and the rest of the work was done by the machine itself. Anyways, going back to the original comics run, Dr. Brainwave was introduced right away as a candidate for Cobra's science office, considering that Dr. Venom, his predecessor, was killed off due to a grenade. And even though some of his experiments were absolute failures, the one that led to the creation of Serpentor is the one where we could see him having an arc with Cobra that's worth exploring. The doctor clearly convinced Cobra Commander to let him use the brainwave scanner, and he was also using the genetic material of historical figures like Genghis Khan, Alexander the Great, and others to create the perfect super soldier. Brainwave was aware of what he was doing and also managed to bring in some genetic material from Storm Shadow into the mix. So the Marvel Comics origin arc for this mad scientist shouldn't really be the goofy story involving the kid named Adam, and by the way, we completely forgot to mention Professor Apple. Yup, that one's a bit of a deep cut, but Mindbender's true origin story in this take actually lies in the original comic book run, where we saw the mad scientist take a turn and turn into something that would become iconic in a franchise full of iconic characters.
Stop him before he destroys any more DNA!
Sunbow brings the scientist who planned a coup. If you, like us, think that the Cobra Commander has had way too many attempts and failures to take down the Joes over the years, then this one might be interesting for you. The Sunbow G.I. Joe animated series once again features Dr. Mindbender, who's provided the villains with his greatest creation, the Battle Android Troopers, or what they all call BATs. In the first episode of the second season, we see another failed attack on the Joe's base, and Cobra Commander mocks the invention, and that's enough to make Dr. Mindbender speak out about what we had all been thinking. I mean, no, not that. Nobody's going to say that out loud. But the man literally utters the words,
"The time is coming when Cobra must find a new leader."
And I mean, we get it. We'd be annoyed too if Cobra Commander gave us the nickname Fenderbender. What follows is a strange dream where he's pitted against Cobra Commander, but he saves himself with one of his weird inventions. So he realizes that if he can't find a successor, then it's better to make one himself, and that's when the Serpentor story comes into play. There's a lot more to that dream, but we'll come back to it in a second. So, Dr. Mindbender collaborates with Destro, Tomax, and Zammot to proceed with the plan to acquire DNA samples from some of the best military minds in history so that Cobra could finally have a leader who would inspire them. The process isn't easy, however, because both Cobra Commander and Sergeant Slaughter become a hurdle, so much so that at one point, Mindbender failed to obtain General Sun Tzu's DNA and instead decided to use Sergeant Slaughter's genetic makeup. But despite all that, he finally succeeds and creates Serpentor, someone he would soon end up calling a spoiled brat. Mindbender ended up serving Serpentor quite well, as the latter came to trust the scientist the most under his leadership. Even though we didn't have an origin in this case, we definitely do get to see how, once again, Mindbender proves his worth in a unique manner. Unlike last time when Serpentor's creation was ordered by Cobra Commander, this time around it was completely in protest of the poorly executed authority of Cobra Commander, and while most of his creations did fail over time against the Joes, it was Serpentor that really proved his worth.
Created you, Serpentor. You are mine. No!
Serpentor wasn't his plan after all. So, about those dreams. Following the peak success of the G.I. Joe animated series, Hasbro was shifting towards the feature film world, with My Little Pony the movie and The Transformers the movie having already been released. So, Buzz Dixon, who had been the writer for the first season of the animated series and its subsequent season, began to work on the film. And that's where we get a major twist, and to fully understand it in the 1987 film, we have to listen to what Buzz Dixon says. In an interview with Brett White for Pop Heist, Dixon stated, "I was now the story editor of G.I. Joe. Initially, we only had 25 episodes to do, and I had come up with an idea for a story I was going to call The Most Dangerous Man in the World, which was going to be my take on the origin of Cobra. It was basically about the Karl Marx Friedrich Nietzsche of Cobra, who Cobra Commander had kept locked up because Cobra Commander had gone so far afield from what the guy had espoused, and I did a treatment, I sent it in, it got approved by executive producers Tom Griffin and Joe Bacal, and then it went over to Hasbro, and Hasbro sent back a note that said, 'Great, go to script. Just make sure you include the Cobra Emperor.' I said, 'The Cobra who?' And they said, 'The Cobra Emperor.' And I said, 'Well, who's the Cobra Emperor?' And they said, 'He's the guy who runs Cobra.' And I said, 'No, he's not. We've spent an entire season establishing Cobra Commander as the supreme commander of Cobra. If you had asked us to, we could have planted little hints that there might have been somebody above him, but we can't just introduce this character without explaining where he comes from.' So they thought about it, and they said, 'Okay, come up with a couple of ideas.' And my advice to all writers is, if somebody asks you to come up with a couple of ideas, only come up with the one you want to do. Because I came up with two possible explanations for the origin of the character that eventually became Serpentor. One was that Dr. Mindbender creates him out of the DNA of all these military leaders in the past, and the other was that there was some super secret organization behind Cobra that we hadn't known about until now. And I sent these into Hasbro, and Hasbro gets back to me and says, 'Great, do it.' And I said, 'Do which one?' They said, 'Both of them.' So yeah, the first story is what we got in the second season of the animated series with Mindbender's coup against the Cobra Commander, but the film, which follows up on the second season of the series, provides a twist. That very dream that influenced Mindbender to create Serpentor was actually the result of Globulus, the leader of Cobra Law and his psychic motivator. When Globulus first presented these facts, Dr. Mindbender was deeply offended and claimed that he alone owned this superior being. But then, Destro, someone who has probably witnessed the failure of several of the Doctor's creations in dealing with the Joes, figured it out right away and pointed out that it does seem weird that Mindbender would be able to hatch such a genius plan. And listen, we love a mad scientist, so this felt like a really unfair take on Dr. Mindbender's character, who became a mere puppet for more powerful entities. Armon Singh. IDW ran a couple of different arcs that offered their own take on the G.I. Joe lore, and to be honest, this might have been the very arc that influenced the 2009 film. Here, the first time we witness our Doctor was in 2008, issue 4, where Destro is taken on a tour of Cobra's secret bases by the Baroness herself. As Destro sees his research being put through at Cobra's facilities, Baroness introduces him to their chief scientific mind, Dr. Mindbender. But here, his real name is Dr. Armon Singh, a new development, possibly due to the thick accent he had in the animated series. Destro and Armand have some quick banter and check out each other's qualifications, and they've both clearly done their research. Anyways, Dr. Mindbender's major arc here is about using humanity's extreme intellectual capabilities to eventually replace the idea of a god entirely. In fact, he's not very far from people who have played around with the idea of being gods, because the 2010 arc from G.I. Joe Hearts and Minds issue 4 indicates that he had worked with Dr. Oppenheimer during the Manhattan Project. In fact, if you imagine Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer, Armand was right next to Hans Beth, as the Cobra scientist had suggested a shaped charge system to prevent pre-initiation. Apparently, it garnered him quite a bit of praise from his mentor. How about that, Destro? Do you still think you're cooler than Armand Singh? Now, that said, the signs of who Armand would eventually become were right there, as he was amongst those who burned the anti-nuclear petitions as the reality of their science began to dawn on the other scientists. On the other hand, he's also shown to be working on polio vaccines, even though his methods are, questionable to say the least. Regardless, the version of Dr. Mindbender we get here is overjoyed by pushing the limits of science as far as they can go. Now, that's an origin story that goes beyond the mellow dentist version that Marvel gave him, as the Dr. Mindbender we get here is more interested in finding new ways to push boundaries rather than being limited to something ordinary. And, after all, Cobra did provide him with that ability and the space to do so.
Overkill's gone mad!
Well, at least
The Monster Without a Past. In the 2003 and 2004 CGI animated G.I. Joe movies, you can clearly see that Dr. Mindbender was just a scientist dedicated to pleasing his master, Cobra Commander. Yeah, we don't get any hints at his background or even a touch of what made him so subservient. We just saw him going, "That shall be done," to everything Cobra Commander asks for. He had perfected some of the technology and was about to completely update the bats, something the Joes saw as a possible threat and therefore stopped. Earlier versions never made him appear this subservient. It almost seemed as though this was treated as a comedic trope, where Cobra Commander would demand something right away and Mindbender would comply. But in the midst of all that, his hatred for the constant nagging did come through. In fact, at the end of Spy Troops, when the Cobra base is destroyed and Mindbender's research is erased along with it, he's visibly angry. Cobra Commander asks him to start over, but you can see this was the very moment that could have triggered something like Serpentor. Sadly though, this CGI series was cancelled well before they got into that storyline. The Biohorror Prodigy. Imagine the Zack Snyder DCU Lex Luthor version of Dr. Mindbender, and that's exactly what G.I. Joe Renegades gave us. The story is a wholly different and fresh take on the world of G.I. Joe, but if nobody had told us that was Dr. Mindbender we were looking at in that secret Cobra base, we would never have guessed. Where's the mustache? Where's the circus getup that made him bare-chested all the time? That said, removing these things didn't actually make him softer, because this series took the brutality of his creations to a whole new level. Although his origin isn't explored in this series either, we do get to hear that Brian Bender was someone who had been on the FBI's list for a while before he was scooped up by Cobra. And based on the Bio-Viper project he was working on for them, it's clear there was some illegal biological experiments in his past. When the Joes ended up facing the Bio-Vipers firsthand, in the process of making it out of there, Ripcord had to sacrifice himself. However, he survived, and Bender ended up giving him the Winter Soldier treatment, turning him into a human/Bio-Viper hybrid for research purposes. Apart from that, the guy is a complete clown and talks a lot, only to fail to deliver, And the one thing that stopped Cobra Commander from executing him is the fact that he was working on making the Commander immortal. For longtime fans of the franchise, it's important to note that the Bats were supposed to be androids, but the bio-vipers that the Mindbender in this series was working on were actually experiments on biological life forms. Yep, that just pushes these scientists to a whole new level of crazy that hadn't been explored before. By the way, one of the biggest questions fans posed to the creators at Comic-Cons was about where Mindbender's bald head and monocle had gone. According to the writers, they were building up to that, and there was going to be an accident that caused his hair to fall out and a punch that would affect his eyesight, but we only got to see this fresh, unblemished version until he was sucked into the wormhole, along with Baroness. G.I. Joe, The Rise of Cobra, the origin that didn't care. Now we've got the 2009 film. The first live-action adaptation of the franchise didn't give us the best take on the franchise, but it did show us the possibilities of where it could go. These movies were sadly kind of doomed from the very beginning, but still, the 2009 film actually had an appearance by Dr. Mindbender with Kevin J. O'Connor playing him, and it's probably the shortest tease for the character we could have gotten. We see him appear in a flashback sequence where Rex, played by Joseph Gordon-Levitt, explains what happened inside the lab where he was presumed to be dead. According to him, both he and the Doctor, who appeared with that classic monocle look, survived the blast, and it was then that the latter shared the secrets of nanotechnology with Rex. Rex ended up becoming Cobra Commander, but we never found out what happened to the Doctor. Director Stephen Sommers wanted to hype up the fans by saying there's a chance we might get to see the Doctor in the sequel based on deleted scenes that hint at his survival, but sadly, we never got to see that. I mean, if we're getting Storm Shadow and Snake Eyes in their iconic costume, then there's no reason for keeping Dr. Mindbender from his crazy circus mustache and bare chest fit. Let's just hope Hasbro someday figures out a way to actually bring this character to live action properly. I mean, if they can make Dr. Robotnik from the Sonic movies look accurate, then Dr. Mindbender should be easy pickings. Sadly, that's all we got for you this time, but if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe if you'd like to see more content like this. Otherwise, thanks for watching, stay safe out there, and we'll see ya in the next one.